What's up, Wolverines? Kenna here. So today we're going to go ahead and continue on with our investigation of evolution. Last class we really started looking more in depth at Darwin and the process of natural selection. Today we're going to go ahead and look at how that acts in terms of how selection works and reminding ourselves that you can't select something that isn't there. We will also talk a little bit about how we can tie this to Mendel and where that natural variation comes from. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right in. So here are our essential questions. Number one, what is genetic variation and what are the sources of this variation? Hopefully you remember some of this when we were talking about genetics earlier this term. And number two, what role do genes and allele frequency play in evolution? All right, now Darwin's ideas have been around for a while, but it wasn't actually until around 1910 that biologists began to realize that genes were the key source of evolutionary change. Darwin would have loved to have known about Gregor Mendel's work, but Mendel's work was kind of stuck away in the abattoir where he worked and didn't come to wider knowledge until much later. Okay, this led, however, to the combining of work from Mendel and Darwin and today's push for genetics and molecular biology to work in evolution. And so we're seeing a connection of these two previously separate fields to help develop a better understanding of both genetics and evolution over many years of time when we combine the work of the two great thinkers. So, first of all, what is genetic variation? Hopefully, you remember that genotype is one thing and phenotype is another. Genotype is the actual alleles an individual possesses, and the phenotype is how those alleles express themselves in terms of the physical characteristic or trait. So, genetic variation is a measure of the genetic differences that exist within a population. The genetic variation of an entire species is what's known as genetic diversity. Okay. Now, there are four sources for genetic variation. Number one, and this is the beginning of everything, is mutations. Mutations can create completely new alleles that never existed before. Almost every allele that you're ever going to see started out as a mutation and became adopted over time. Number two, random mating. Now, this is only true for sexual reproducing organisms, but random mating that is based on survival, not on attractiveness, means that the traits that are most beneficial for the population are going to go ahead and get passed on to future generations. We also have random fertilization. We don't pick the sperm and egg in most cases that are going to determine what the offspring get. Now, this does happen from time to time when we start looking at things like IVF. We can select the best candidates in terms of the egg and sperm. And so this is changing a little bit, but in general, for large populations, random mating, random fertilization. And lastly, because we have random mating and random fertilization, we get what's known as gene shuffling. This is the mixing of traits that's the result of sexual reproduction. And so you're combining some from mom and some from dad to make the new combination that produces the genotype and phenotype of the offspring. All right. So it's important to point out here that when we think about natural selection, choosing the best traits, it's exactly that. It's picking based on the trait or the phenotype, not on the genotype. It's not that it doesn't affect the genotype, it does, because when you select a phenotype, you're ending up impacting what the genotypes will be for future generations. But if it's not there, you can't act on it. Okay. So the only way you can get a new variation is through the development of a mutation that ends up providing some selective advantage. So genetic variation is very important force in evolution as it allows natural selection to increase or decrease the frequency of particular alleles that are already in the population. Let me say that again, that are already in the population. Natural selection can't create something out of nothing. Natural selection can only select the most beneficial trait in a particular environment from what is already there. So genetic variation is advantageous to a population because it enables some of the individuals to adapt to their environment while maintaining the survival of the overall population. Individuals accumulate small changes over time, and those small changes are either helping or hurting or having little to no impact on the survival of the organism. But because it's just one organism, we can try out new things, new waters, without dooming the entire species to die because of it. So then we start looking at if we've got all this natural variation that exists within a single population, we have a huge, what we call, gene pool. So this is the combination of all of the genetic information of all of the members of a particular population. So in a particular area, all of these individuals combined make up the gene pool in terms of their DNA. Now, a gene pool will typically contain at least two alleles, but it could be two or more alleles for every inheritable trait. So when we start thinking about eye color, hair color, height, skin tone, this is a whole bunch of different traits, and they have at least two, sometimes three or more, for each trait. Okay, so the gene pool accounts for a lot of genetic diversity within a particular population. So when we start looking at a particular trait and we look at the diversity or the variety of alleles that exist for that particular trait, what we're typically talking about is what's known as relative frequency. So the relative frequency of an allele is the number of times that that particular allele shows up in a gene pool. This is compared to the number of times other alleles show up in a gene pool. And it's usually going to be expressed as a percentage. Let's say we have 40% of this allele, 60% of this allele. And notice that those allele frequencies, right, need to total out to 100%. Now, keep in mind, natural selection, once again, does not act on the genotype. It acts on the phenotype of an organism. Okay, it's a very important thing to keep in mind that natural selection acts on the phenotype of an organism, not its genotype. So let's give you a quick example of this relative frequency. Let's look at a population of mice. Let's say in this particular population, we have two colors that we look at. We have black and we have brown. And in this particular population, we have 48% of the mice are what we call heterozygous black, 16% are homozygous black, and 36% are homozygous brown. Now, why do I have it set up this way? When you take a look at this, at first glance, you'll notice that most of the mice are black because black is the dominant color. It shows up in the heterozygous condition. However, if you look at the actual alleles and number of alleles, you will notice that there are more homozygous brown mice than there are homozygous black mice, which means that there are actually more brown alleles in this population than there are black alleles. Even though there are more black mice, there are more brown alleles because the brown allele is recessive and you get one dominant and one recessive allele when you get a heterozygous individual. All right. So there are two different instances we need to talk a little bit about. The first of these is what we call single gene natural selection. Now, the number of phenotypes produced for a given trait depends on how many genes control that trait. So for now, we're going to focus on single gene traits. So there's one gene that impacts the outcome. Natural selection on single gene traits can lead to changes in allele frequencies and thus to evolution. In these instances, negatively affecting traits are likely to be limited or wiped out of the population altogether because it's a single gene trait. That's not necessarily going to be true in the same way when we start looking at polygenic traits, which we'll do in a little bit. But before we go ahead and talk about polygenic traits, there's one more thing I want to talk about that's unique to single gene natural selection, and that's what's known as genetic drift. Now, in very small populations, Individuals that carry a particular allele may leave more descendants than other individuals, not because of natural selection, but just purely by chance. And over time, a series of chance occurrences of this type can cause an allele to become common in a population for no particular reason. And this is what's called genetic drift. So let's take a look at these beetles here on the left side. Now, if you take a look at all these beetles, there's a fair amount of variety in terms of their carapace color and pattern. And let's assume that a major forest fire comes through this population and it wipes out the vast majority of them. But just by chance, there are two little isolated pockets where these beetles survive, not because they're more fit for the environment, but just because of where they happen to be at the time of the forest fire, they survived. And so what you see is you see a burnout of all these, and now you've just got these what we call founding populations. The top founding population and the bottom founding population, we'll call them A and B, do not look the same and do not necessarily completely reflect the previous conditions within the population before the fire. But because natural selection only can use what's there, and let's assume they can't interbreed with each other, then the two populations over time are going to start to look different. If you take a look, you'll notice that the descendants in population A have far more black carapace and no gray carapaces. Okay, so far more black and no gray. The spotting is varied there, but that's not that different from the original population. If you go to founding population B, you'll notice there are no black carapaces and far more gray carapaces. Okay, and this is simply due to the random fact that those particular beetles happen to be in a place that survived the fire. It's not a fitness in this particular instance that made them more successful, simply that they were in the right place at the right time. So that's what's called genetic drift, where random chance plays a role in the development of future traits within a particular species. Now let's go ahead and move on to another trait called genetic equilibrium. The situation in which allele frequencies remain constant is known as genetic equilibrium. If allele frequencies do not change, the population will not evolve. So genetic equilibrium does not lead to evolution. So what must be in place in order for genetic equilibrium to occur? There are 5 conditions that we look at that we use to go ahead and measure as a tool for genetic equilibrium. Now, as I'm going through these, I want you to think about which ones are realistic and which ones are less realistic, and then think about those with respect to the human population. All right. So, 1, there must be random mating. Okay. Now, in nature, this for the most part happens. There is some movement away from that when we start looking at selective pressures from nature, a lot of predators, we start looking at major changes in weather. And so then this isn't always true. Number 2, the population must be very large. Okay, bigger populations see more genetic equilibrium than smaller populations. Okay. Number 3, there must be no movement into or out of the population. So no immigration, no emigration. Now, keep that in mind, and especially when we start thinking about human population, how many of these do we actually meet? Number 4, there can be no mutations. And number 5, there can be no natural selection. Now, hopefully you're recognizing that these last two are fairly unrealistic. And so the chance of any population reaching a true genetic equilibrium is highly unlikely unless it's a heavily controlled population. So keep those things in mind. We've talked about genetic drift, we've talked about genetic equilibrium, we've talked about gene shuffling and the impact of genotype on phenotype, but the fact that phenotype is the only thing that natural selection acts on. And if something doesn't exist within the species, barring a mutation, it can't happen in a species. So natural selection only works on things that are already there in terms of the natural variations and genetic diversity that exists within a species. Okay, guys, have a great rest of your day. Take care of yourselves. Stay happy, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye bye.